Inflation got you down? I got 4 ways you can fight back. Hi, this is financial planner Sean Mullaney. Let's discuss. So inflation, the devaluing of a currency, particularly as applied to us Americans, the US dollar, not fun, right? Diminishes purchasing power, makes that paycheck go less and less far every pay period. Not at all fun. But I've got 4 things you should consider to fight back and to give yourself some protection against future inflation. The first thing is tax planning. There are things you can do from a tax planning perspective to reduce the impact of inflation. The big one I like are Roth IRA, Roth 401k contributions, and HSA contributions. Why do I say them? Because they have tax-free growth. And what they're doing is they're moving money into accounts that are never going to be taxed based on inflation, assuming you play by the rules, you do everything right. But tax-free growth has this nice side effect of getting inflationary growth out of taxation. Contrast that to a traditional IRA or a traditional 401k, which have many tax advantages, absolutely. But one downside is they grow, and some of that growth is going to be subject to inflation. And when it's withdrawn, some of that growth is going to be inflation that's not real economic growth, and that's going to be subject to income tax. That's a way of subjecting income or inflation to an income tax. Not so great, right? It's a drawback of the traditional IRA. Now you might be saying, okay, great, I love this Roth concept, but there's only so many dollars I can put into a Roth account every year, and I still want some of those juicy tax deductions. So what might I want to think about? Well, I think when you think about Roth IRA versus Roth 401k, you want to think about opportunity cost. And many people who can do a Roth annual contribution or could even do a backdoor Roth IRA, those people oftentimes do not qualify to deduct a traditional IRA contribution based on the tax rules. So sometimes the dynamic duo, the best 1-2 punch might be do a $6,000 or $7,000 annual Roth IRA contribution or backdoor Roth if it works for you. And then at work, max out a 401k. You're sort of getting the best of both worlds. You're getting some nice juicy tax deductions and getting some money into Roth IRAs and shielding that from taxation on inflation. Okay, so that's the first one. What about the second tactic? Second tactic is fixed rate debt. Here's the thing about those 30-year mortgages that you might have been thinking about paying off. Turns out if they're at a low interest rate, they are a great hedge against inflation. I think what this recent episode of inflation has demonstrated to us is we ought to think twice about paying off mortgages. Not that it might not have some other beneficial financial effects, but boy, it's nice to have a long-term, low fixed rate mortgage out there as a hedge against inflation. Why not pay back the bank with future dollars rather than today's dollars? If we continue to have inflation, you've got a great inflation hedge. Inflation helps debtors. It hurts creditors, right? So what you're sort of hoping when you have a 30-year mortgage is, hey, maybe we have some inflation and I'll pay back the bank in years 15, 16, 17, 25, 29, 30 with devalued dollars, okay? So that's a great hedge where inflation becomes your friend, not your foe. Now, nothing's perfect in personal finance, and there's usually going to be some trade-offs. One of the big trade-offs when you keep that mortgage alive is now you're subject to deflation, right? There's no immutable law that says we're always going to be in an inflationary environment. It's possible that currencies deflate, which means they appreciate in value, which means if you keep that mortgage alive, you'd be paying back the bank with higher value dollars than if you just paid off the bank early in the term of the 30-year mortgage. So it's a trade-off, right? But if you're particularly worried about inflation, maybe keeping that 30-year mortgage alive and not paying a penny too soon might be a good inflation hedge for you. Third thing to think about when fighting inflation, travel rewards. There are many credit cards and these sorts of things that offer bonuses for hotels, airfare, that sort of thing. These travel rewards can be a bit of an inflation hedge in 2 ways. One, you can use bonuses and other accrued points to pay instead of cash. for hotels, airfare that might be going up from a cash perspective. Now remember, those reward points are subject to inflation just like dollars are, because they're controlled by a central authority, usually the credit card company, the airline, the hotel, whoever it is. They sort of control the value of those points too. So they're subject to inflation, but they can be a nice little hedge against dollar inflation. And then the second thing to think about from a inflation and travel rewards perspective is some of these programs have free nights or companion certificates, those sorts of things where you're getting out of this idea of paying for dollars. You've got a companion certificate, you've got a free night certificate. It's a little bit of a hedge, right? If everything else was equal, you might want to use that sort of credit card in terms of a sign-up bonus to get a little bit of the benefit there. And then the fourth one, and I think this is a big one, particularly in the financial independence community, is don't spend dollars today that lead to more spending tomorrow. So let me give you a few examples, right? So if you go and you buy a large SUV with poor gas mileage, guess what? You're locking in some future inflation because you're locking in more gas expenses because you don't get such good gas mileage, right? A smaller sedan is less subject to inflation in terms of gas prices than, say, that big SUV, because that smaller sedan per mile is going to require less gas, right? So if we spend today on an item, we should be thinking about, well, what does that spending look like tomorrow, right? You buy that SUV, more gasoline spending tomorrow. What about a house, right? If you buy a new house or an older house, think about the maintenance costs on that house. Think about the square footage and what does that mean for heating and cooling costs. Does it have a pool outside? Well, that pool's got costs. You got to buy chemicals. You got to buy, maintenance. You may have to hire a person to clean the pool, to keep up with the chemicals, those sorts of things. So think about a house when you're buying it in terms of its future costs, and more future costs means more future inflation. Another one I think about is what you're eating, right? You got to spend money today, and you're going to be subject to food inflation today. There's nothing you can do about that. But maybe you should be avoiding sugars and seed oils, vegetable oils. These things tend to lead to more medical costs in the future, meaning you're going to have higher medical inflation in the future. So today's spending can provide some defense against future inflationary burdens, right? So when you spend money today, you want to be concerned about today's inflation, but what about tomorrow's inflation? I hope those 4 points helped you. Let me know what you think and what you're doing to fight inflation in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, please mash that like button and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.